The summer of 1997 in Harrows Creek, Arkansas, was unusually hot, humid, and tense. The kind of weather where the skies hang heavy with something unsaid, where even the birds seem to fly lower. The town, tucked between overgrown woods and forgotten roads, hadn't seen a storm like the one that rolled in on July 3rd, a day before Independence Day. That morning began like any other. The Monroe family farmhouse stood quietly among the fields, its wood-framed windows open to let in the faint breeze, white curtains swaying softly. Inside, 11-year-old triplets, Abigail, Bethany, and Claire, giggled as they finished their cereal, bare feet tapping against the worn hardwood floor. Their brother Lucas, just turned 16, was already outside working in the barn with their father. No one knew that this would be the last normal morning the family would ever have. Late in the afternoon, dark clouds rolled over the ridge. The local radio issued a tornado watch, then upgraded it to a warning. Residents were used to severe weather in July, but this one felt different. The air turned electric. The clouds hung unnaturally low. Thunder rumbled in long, distant growls. Margaret Monroe, the girl's mother, called them inside. Lucas helped his father tie down the storm shutters, then ran in as wind gusts turned violent. By 5:47 p.m., the power had gone out. The family huddled in the cellar, just as they'd done before in past storms. Except this time, it wasn't enough. The tornado that hit Harrows Creek was later classified as an EF4, with winds exceeding 170 miles per hour. Trees snapped like twigs, roofs tore, from homes like paper. The Monroe farmhouse shuddered as the storm passed over. The ground trembled, screams mixed with the howl of the wind, and then, in a single moment, silence. When Lucas awoke, he was buried beneath pieces of wood and soil. His forehead was bleeding. His ears rang. When he clawed his way out of the cellar, wreckage. He found his father unconscious but alive, his mother bruised and crying. But the triplets, they were gone. There was no sign of them, no blood, no bodies, not even footprints. The days that followed were chaos. Neighbors gathered. Rescue crews came in from the county. Helicopters hovered above the torn countryside. Dogs were brought in. Volunteers combed every corner of the fields and woods for miles. The farmhouse, or what was left of it, became the headquarters for hope and heartbreak. But there was nothing. Not a ribbon, not a shoe, not even a piece of clothing. Authorities believed the storm may have carried the girls away, perhaps into the river, which had flooded during the rain. But the Monroe family refused to accept it. The bodies would have surfaced. Something would have turned up. But nothing did. The story made the local news. A few reporters from Little Rock came down to cover it. Tragedy in Harrows Creek ran in the headlines for a few days before the world moved on. But the Monroes never did. Lucas, once a quiet, playful teen, became withdrawn. His parents, now broken under the weight of unanswered questions, tried to hold on. But the absence of their daughters hollowed the home from the inside out. Time passed. School years faded into silence. Christmases came and went with empty stockings. Lucas graduated, then left town. He couldn't bear the quiet anymore. The land was sold to pay for medical bills and new beginnings. The farmhouse, or what was left of it, was boarded up. For most, the Triplet sisters became a tragic ghost story, something whispered to newcomers at the gas station or recounted by the elderly during summer thunderstorms. But Lucas never let it go. By 2017, Lucas was 36 years old. He had moved 2 hours east, worked odd jobs, and avoided attachments. His parents had since passed, his mother from cancer, his father from a heart attack 5 years later. The grief was never resolved. There were no funerals for the triplets, just a shared gravestone in the Harrows Creek Cemetery with their names and the words, "Taken too soon, but not forgotten." Lucas visited the grave once a year, leaving 3 lilies every time. But something in him refused closure. Deep down, he felt the girls hadn't died that night. Not all of them, maybe. He didn't know why he felt it, only that the absence of evidence had left a door cracked open in his soul, a door he couldn't close, no matter how many years passed. In March 2020, after years of nightmares, he returned to Harrow's Creek. He told no one. The town had changed. New houses stood where woods had once grown wild. The road that led to the old farmhouse was barely recognizable, weeds, rusted fences, and trees reclaiming the land. He had come to say goodbye, finally. But what he found changed everything. Lucas parked his truck just before the property line. The driveway that once welcomed his family home was almost invisible beneath layers of overgrowth. Thorns and branches scraped the sides of the vehicle as he drove through, slowly, heart pounding with each foot forward. The house, or what remained of it, stood like a forgotten skeleton of the past. The roof had collapsed in on itself years ago. One wall had crumbled completely, exposing what used to be the living room. Vines snaked across the floorboards and into the broken hearth. Lucas stood at the edge of the ruins, hands in his pockets, wind tugging gently at his coat. The place felt more like a tomb than a memory. But he didn't come to grieve. He came because he needed to look one last time. He spent hours walking the land. The barn was mostly gone. The cellar had caved in, and the wooden door was now a jagged hole into blackness. The storm had erased so much, but something still whispered through the decay, faint outlines of where the girls used to play, the tree they carved their initials into, the spot where they buried their time capsule the year before the storm. Lucas stopped near the back edge of the property, where the fields once met the tree line. He hadn't been this far back in decades. Something pulled him here, like a thread buried deep beneath his ribs. The ground was uneven and soft from recent rains. Trees creaked overhead, and birds scattered as he stepped through the underbrush. Then he saw it, something pale poking out from the dirt near an old fence post. It was small, rounded, and half covered in soil. At first, he thought it might be a rock, but as he knelt down and brushed it off, the shape became unmistakable. It was a shoe, a child's shoe, caked in mud, brittle from age, but still intact. Pale blue canvas with a frayed strap and a faded daisy on the side. His breath caught in his throat. He remembered it instantly. It belonged to Claire. The shoe didn't make sense. The area had been searched, combed again and again for weeks after the storm. No one had found a trace. Yet here it was, not even fully buried. It looked like it had surfaced recently, like something, or someone, had moved it. Lucas sat in the dirt for a long time, holding the shoe in his lap, heart pounding. The wind picked up again, colder now, heavier with something unspeakable. He went back the next day with tools. If something else was buried out there, he was going to find it. He dug carefully, methodically, starting where he found the shoe. It didn't take long. A few feet down, the earth changed color. The soil was looser, disturbed. Lucas slowed his movements, hands shaking, sweat rolling down his back despite the cool air. He hit something hard, not a rock, but wood, a box. Small, flat, with rusted hinges and a metal latch. It took effort to pull it out without breaking it apart completely. The box was no larger than a shoebox. The latch crumbled easily under his grip. Inside, wrapped in a piece of pink cloth, was a collection of items. He unfolded it slowly. There was a locket, a tiny notebook, a friendship bracelet made of colored thread, and a Polaroid photo. The photo was faded but clear enough to make out the faces. Abigail, Bethany, and Claire standing in front of the tree line, smiling. Behind them stood someone else, a man. His face was half in shadow, turned just slightly away. Lucas stared at the photo in disbelief. He knew the picture. It was taken on the morning of the storm. But this version had never existed in the family albums. The man in the photo wasn't their father. He wasn't anyone Lucas recognized. Panic surged in his chest. He looked at the back of the photo. Scribbled in faint pencil were the words, "Last game before we go, he promised." Lucas's hands trembled as he stared at the note. His mind swirled with impossible questions. Who was the man? What did he promise? Why had this box been buried behind the old fence, far from the house? And why had it resurfaced now? He reported the discovery to the sheriff's office the next morning. Harrow's Creek didn't have much of a department, just a few officers, and a part-time detective. They took the items, filed a report, and promised to reopen the case. But Lucas saw the doubt in their eyes. Cold cases this old rarely ended in answers. Most people assumed nature had swallowed the girls, but now there was proof someone else had been involved. The case caught attention fast. When the sheriff's office submitted the locket and bracelet for testing, DNA confirmed the items had indeed belonged to the Monroe sisters. The notebook, filled with short scribbles and drawings, matched Bethany's handwriting. But none of the items explained where they'd gone or how the box ended up buried 2 decades later. Then something even more bizarre happened. A week after the news broke, an elderly farmer named Wade Lerman came forward. He lived on the next property over, about a mile of woods separating his land from what used to be the Monroes. He'd worked that land since the 1960s, knew every inch of it, but he'd never spoken about what he'd seen that night, not until now. He told the sheriff about a truck, an old green pickup that had been parked at the edge of the Monroe property, the night of the storm. He remembered it because it didn't belong to anyone local. He remembered it because in the chaos of that evening, with trees swaying and thunder shaking the sky, he'd seen 3 small figures being led into the truck by a man. He thought at the time it was just the family evacuating. But when he learned the girls had vanished and had never been found, he kept quiet, thinking maybe his eyes had played tricks on him. Lucas sat in the station, listening to the recording of Wade's statement, fists clenched. The man had seen them. Claire, Abigail, and Bethany had been alive after the storm, and someone, some man, had taken them. That meant they hadn't just been lost. They'd been taken, hidden, or worse. Lucas couldn't sleep that night. He drove back to the property and sat in the field where the shoe was found, flashlight in hand. He didn't know what he was looking for, maybe nothing, maybe everything. The wind howled again, like it did that night. The air felt thick, full of ghosts. Just before midnight, the beam of his flashlight caught something among the brush, a small wooden stake. He walked toward it, hard in his throat. It was old, weather-worn, but still upright. A second stake stood 10 feet beyond it, then another. A pattern emerged, a path. He followed them into the woods, each step louder in his ears than the last. The stakes led him deeper than he remembered ever going, past fallen trees and crumbling stone markers. Finally, the path ended at a clearing, a circular patch of earth surrounded by tall pines. In the center stood a small concrete slab, half buried under vines. Lucas knelt, pulling them back. A metal hatch lay beneath the dirt. His breath stopped. The hatch had no markings, no handle, just a narrow seam around its edge. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years, maybe decades, but someone had built it, hidden it, and whatever lay beneath might hold the answers he had been chasing for 20 years. Lucas returned the next morning with tools, a crowbar, gloves, a flashlight, and a growing dread in his chest. The hatch felt older than anything else on the property. Yet it wasn't marked on any of the original land surveys he found online. It was like someone had intentionally hidden it where no one would think to look. He worked carefully, wedging the crowbar into the seam, prying and pulling. The rusted metal groaned in protest before finally giving way. A gust of cold air rushed up from below, damp and stale. A metal ladder descended into darkness. He stared down into the opening, flashlight beam shaking slightly in his hand. The space below was narrow and silent. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he took a breath and climbed down. The room was small, no larger than a storage cellar. concrete walls, a dirt floor, and one long wooden bench along the far side. The air was thick with dust and mildew. In the corner sat a rusted metal cabinet, partially open. On the floor, scattered and faded, were toys, a stuffed rabbit, a plastic hairbrush, a puzzle missing pieces, the kind of toys an 8- or 9-year-old might have once loved. Lucas moved slowly, scanning the room, his eyes landing on a torn notebook near the cabinet. He picked it up gently. The first few pages were illegible, damaged by time and moisture. But halfway through, scrawled in childlike handwriting, was a date. August 14th, 1998, over a year after the storm. The entry read, "Abe's tooth came out today. Beth cried because she thinks we'll never go home. He said we're not ready yet. He keeps the door locked most of the day now. It's cold at night." Lucas's knees gave out. He sat on the floor, hands shaking, eyes wide with horror. The girls had been alive, locked in this space. For how long? How many days, months, years? The pages that followed were increasingly erratic. Notes about food being brought once a day, the girls keeping track of time with scratches on the wall. One entry mentioning someone named Mr. E, another mentioning a song he would hum before entering the room. But the entries stopped abruptly in 1999. No explanation, just a final page with a drawing. 3 small girls holding hands, standing under a cloud with rain falling down. Underneath, written in shaky letters, were the words, "We're still here." Lucas emerged from the underground room, pale and stunned. He called the sheriff immediately. Forensics came within hours. The space was photographed, catalogued, and sealed. Off. Tests would take weeks, maybe months, but everyone already knew. The sisters had been taken, hidden less than a mile from their home, and kept alive, at least for a while. The question that followed was the hardest one. Why? That same week, the sheriff's department pulled archived missing person reports and cold case files. They started looking into anyone in the area in 1997 who had a record or who fit the profile. The name that surfaced wasn't someone Lucas recognized: Elmer Yates. He had lived less than 6 miles from the Monroe farm during the 1990s. He had no immediate criminal record then, but neighbors remembered him as strange, quiet, always watching, never talking. He moved away in 2001, was arrested in Oklahoma in 2003 for unrelated charges, but was released a few years later. No one had heard from him since. Lucas's stomach churned at the idea that this man might have been right under their noses the entire time. He went to the town library to dig through old microfilms, scanned any photo, any article that mentioned the name. That's when he found it. An old newspaper clipping from 1996, a photo of a 4th of July church picnic, children on a swing set, parents barbecuing. In the background, almost blurred, stood a man near the trees, watching. The grainy, black and white image didn't offer much, but Lucas knew what he was looking at. It was the same man from the photo in the buried box. Elmer Yates had been there the day before the storm. He had been close, watching, waiting. A warrant was issued within days, but Yates had vanished. The address tied to his parole records in Chespass, Oklahoma was empty. His name had been changed in 2011, his digital footprint scrubbed. Authorities suspected he had either died in anonymity or was living off-grid somewhere far from Arkansas. The community of Harrow's Creek was stunned. For years they had mourned the Triplets as victims of nature, swept away in tragedy. But now the truth was unraveling like an old, threadbare sweater, revealing something darker. Lucas became a recluse after that. The press reached out, but he refused all interviews. What could he say? That he'd walked that land 100 times and never thought to look past the trees? That he had blamed the wind, the rain, the heavens, when all along it had been something far more human? He kept the notebook, the original. The state had wanted to preserve it as evidence, but Lucas fought to keep it. For him, it wasn't evidence. It was a voice, proof that they had endured, survived, tried to send a message. And then one day, he got a call that changed everything again. The sheriff's office had received an anonymous letter, postmarked from Montana. Inside was a single Polaroid, just like the one from the box, but newer, dated July 3, 2017, exactly 20 years since the storm. It showed a woman standing outside what looked like an isolated cabin. Her face was partially turned, hair pulled into a braid. On the back of the photo was a single sentence. "She still hums the song." They ran the photo through facial recognition databases. It didn't match anyone in state or federal records, but Lucas knew. He didn't need software to confirm what his heart already screamed. It was Claire. Lucas stared at the photograph long after the call had ended. He turned it over again and again, tracing the edges of the image as if the truth might bleed out. From its corners, Claire. It had to be her. The braid, the shape of her eyes, even the faint scar near her temple from a fall off her bike when they were 6. It was all there. And yet, it didn't make sense. Why now? Why anonymously? And what did the message mean? She still hums the song. The same song mentioned in the journal entries, the one Mr. E used to hum before opening the door. It haunted Lucas more than any face or photograph. That melody, meaningless to the world, was burned into the memory of 3 girls for decades. Was she still trapped? Was she still under someone's control? Or was the message a signal, something only a sibling would understand? Law enforcement traced the photo's postmark to a small rural town in Montana's Flathead County, but there was no sender information, just the stamp and a smudge of ink. Lucas offered to fly there himself. The sheriff discouraged it, but didn't stop him. Within a week, Lucas was on a flight, the photograph packed carefully between 2 pages of his notebook. He hadn't told anyone, not even his closest friend from work. Some part of him didn't believe he'd return. Or maybe it was that he couldn't face another dead end with an audience. Montana greeted him with snow and silence. Small towns dotted the landscape like forgotten time capsules. He rented a car and drove the highway north, his eyes scanning each rise and bend in the land for something familiar, even though he'd never been here before. The photo had no coordinates, no clear landmarks, just a cabin, a woman, and a blurry stretch of woods in the background. He stopped at gas stations, diners, old post offices, showing the photo around quietly. Most people shook their heads politely. Some didn't even look. It was in a worn-out bait shop on the edge of Glacier National Park that he caught his first break. An older woman behind the counter squinted at the photo, then tapped it lightly, with one calloused finger. "That cabin looks like it might be up along Elk Hollow Trail. Only a few places out that way. Some off-grid types, folks who keep to themselves," she said. Lucas asked how to get there. The woman hesitated before scribbling a rough map on a torn napkin. "You didn't hear it from me," she said, then turned back to stacking fishing lures. The drive was rough. Dirt roads narrowed into gravel, gravel into mud. Trees arched overhead like cathedral ceilings, heavy with snow and silence. After nearly an hour of slow climbing through the hills, he saw it. The cabin. It looked just like the one in the photo. Tilted. Roof, small window to the right, chimney stacked with mismatched stone. No smoke rose from it now. No sign of life. He parked 100 yards back and approached on foot, boots crunching softly over frozen ground. When he reached the porch, he stood still for a long time. No movement inside. No sound. He knocked once. Silence. He knocked again, louder. A flicker behind the curtain. His breath caught in his throat. The door creaked open an inch, just enough for an eye to appear behind it. A single eye, narrowed, cautious, blue. Lucas stepped forward and whispered the names. Abigail, Bethany, Claire. The eye blinked. The door slammed shut. He waited. For 5 minutes, then 10. He knocked again, softly. No answer came. Eventually, he left a small note tucked into the doorframe, folded tightly around the photograph. He wrote only one sentence: "I never stopped looking." And then he walked away. He drove back to town and waited. For 3 days, he stayed in a cheap motel near the highway, leaving his phone on the nightstand like a sacred object. He barely ate, barely slept. On the 4th morning, there was a knock at his motel door. When he opened it, there was no one outside. But on the ground, lying neatly in the center of the doormat, was the photo he had left at the cabin. And underneath, a bracelet, braided threads of pink, yellow, and green, the same kind they used to make on the porch swing in the summer of '97. Lucas knelt on the cold concrete, picking up the bracelet as if it were made of glass. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out the world. It wasn't just similar, it was the exact same pattern Claire had favored, the same 3 colors, the same uneven knot where she had once run out of pink thread. Time had frayed it, yes, but it was unmistakable. It was hers. He stared down the empty corridor of the motel's 2nd floor, hoping to see someone, anyone. But the lot below was quiet. Snowflakes floated gently through the morning light. Whoever had delivered the bracelet had come and gone without a sound. Lucas sat back on his heels and looked at the photo again. Same cabin, same shadowed porch. His note was gone, replaced only by the bracelet. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't a refusal. It was something else. Acknowledgement. That night, Lucas couldn't stay in the motel. He needed to return, not to demand answers, not even to see her, but simply to leave something behind, a message, a sign that he was still here. He drove back to the cabin after dark, headlights off, guided by moonlight and memory. The trees stood like silent witnesses. When he reached the porch, he placed a sealed envelope beneath the woodpile near the door. Inside was an old photograph of the 4 of them, Lucas and the girls, taken the summer before the storm. He had kept it for decades, creased at the E, corners, carried through every move. On the back he wrote, "You are not alone. If you want me to stop, I will. If you want me to stay, leave the porch light on tomorrow." It was all he could think to offer. The next night he returned. The light was on, dim, flickering, but on. Lucas didn't approach the door. He didn't need to. He simply sat in, his car on the ridge above the property, watching from a distance, letting the knowledge settle into his chest like warmth after years of frost. Claire, or someone, was still there. But the next morning, the light was off again. And when he returned to the bait shop to ask a quiet question or two, the old woman behind the counter told him something he didn't expect. "That cabin?" she said, frowning. "It's been empty since the fire. Burned halfway down 10 years ago. Nobody's lived there since." Lucas blinked. "No," he said carefully. "I was just there 2 nights ago." She gave him a strange look. Then, "I don't know what you saw, son, but that place has been dead quiet for a decade." He drove back immediately, heart pounding. The cabin was there, as it had always been. But something was different. The windows were boarded, the roof partially collapsed on one side. The door hung ajar, rotted at the bottom. The chimney was blackened with soot that trailed up into a broken sky. Inside, the floor was warped and cold. Dust coated every surface. The furniture had been tossed, burned, shattered. There were no signs of life, no photo, no bracelet, no fire, no light, only ashes and silence. He dropped to his knees in the center of the ruined living room, breath heaving in his chest. Was he losing his mind? Had he imagined the light, the bracelet, the photo? But then he noticed something on the floor, a symbol drawn in the soot, 3 small circles, side by side. It was the same doodle Claire had drawn in her journals as a child. It was their symbol, the Triplets symbol. Lucas stepped back, overwhelmed. Someone had been here recently. Someone had drawn that, knowing he would understand. This wasn't just grief echoing in empty walls. It was real. Back in Arkansas, news of the cabin photo and the bracelet had reignited interest in the case. The FBI became involved. Behavioral analysts theorized that the girls, or at least one of them, had been taken across state lines, kept alive, possibly groomed into silence, hidden for years by a captor who never planned to let them go. If Claire had escaped, she might have spent the rest of her life hiding, afraid to be found, afraid of what remembering would cost. But none of that brought him closer to the truth. The trail went cold again. Just as quickly as it had reopened, the leads evaporated. The cabin couldn't be tied definitively to anyone. No fingerprints, no DNA. The bracelet, even with its emotional weight, was circumstantial at best. And the note on the photo, it was handwritten, block letters, untraceable. Still, Lucas held on to one belief with absolute certainty. Claire had seen him, and she remembered. The months that followed were quiet, too quiet. Lucas returned home, to Arkansas. But he wasn't the same. Every shadow outside his apartment window, every knock at the door, every flicker of light in a hallway made his heart leap. He had seen something, felt something. That wasn't the part that haunted him. It was the silence afterward, that unbearable silence. He tried to live normally again. He went back to work, made small talk, took out the trash, folded laundry. But in the quiet moments, his mind slipped back into the woods, to the cabin, to the photograph, to the braid, to the bracelet in the snow. He couldn't stop seeing Claire's eye behind that door, and he couldn't forget the message. She still hums the song. It was impossible to ignore the weight of that phrase. It echoed in his dreams, repeated itself during thunderstorms, whispered to him through the hum of the fridge or the radio static in his car. A song meant something. A song tied them to the man who took them. It was a clue, but he didn't know how to follow it. So, he tried to remember everything, every detail about the summer of '97, what songs were playing on the radio, what jingles came from the television, what his sisters used to sing while brushing their teeth, playing in the backyard, or riding their bikes. He pored over home videos, straining for background melodies, but it was all noise until one evening, deep in a YouTube rabbit hole, he found it. A commercial from the early 1990s, a regional ad for a children's puppet show that toured county, fairs in the South. The jingle was childish and overly sweet, but instantly familiar. He played it again, then again. He closed his eyes and could almost hear it beneath Claire's voice in those journal entries. She had written down the phrase, "He hums it before coming in." It was this song. He searched the show's name, Mr. Everly's Carousel Show, and found that it had once traveled through Harrow's Creek in 1995. It was small-time entertainment, a one-man act with puppet characters and handmade backdrops. According to the archived county permit database, it was operated by someone named Everett Yates. Lucas's heart stopped. Yates, not Elmer, Everett. He double-checked the missing persons investigation. The man they had pursued had been listed as Elmer Yates, but a middle name wasn't documented. Lucas called the FBI liaison, insisting they re-examine the case, under the assumption that Elmer and Everett were the same person. Within days, everything shifted. A fingerprint match was found between an old permit form signed by Everett Yates in 1995 and the parole records of Elmer Yates in Oklahoma. They were the same man. It had just been hidden in plain sight by a simple switch of names, something anyone could do in the pre-digital age. And more importantly, Mr. Everly's Carousel Show had passed through more than just Arkansas. It had stopped in Louisiana, Oklahoma, even parts of Colorado. Every stop was marked by missing child reports, young girls gone without a trace, barely mentioned in local papers before being forgotten. The connection was sickening. Lucas sat in his apartment for a long time after the agent told him. The pieces clicked together like teeth in a rusted trap. Claire hadn't been alone. Yates had done this before. Maybe after, maybe always. The photo in the snow, the bracelet, the symbol in the ash. They were messages not just of survival, but of escape. Claire had escaped him. Maybe not physically, maybe not entirely, but mentally, emotionally. She had found a way to defy him, to find her voice again, and now she was using that voice in the only way she could, by leaving clues. Lucas went public with the story. He gave his first interview in April, sitting down with a journalist from a national investigative podcast. He didn't care about the attention. He cared about the reach. He wanted the story to be heard. He wanted it to reach whoever Claire had become, wherever she was hiding. He wanted her to know she wasn't invisible anymore, that people were watching, that her nightmare had been exposed. The podcast worked. Within weeks of its release, new tips began pouring in, sightings, rumors, names. But none led to Claire. What they did lead to, however, was another breakthrough. A woman in northern Wyoming had recognized the man's face from the old puppet show flyer posted on the podcast's website. She had seen him years ago, in 2007. He had been working under a false name at a campground, fixing plumbing and sleeping in an old trailer out back. He had vanished one night without warning, leaving behind nothing but clothes, tools, and a weathered book of poems with the name E. Yates scratched on the inside cover. FBI agents tracked down the trailer, which had since been moved to a junkyard. In a locked toolbox beneath the frame, they found cassette tapes, dozens of them. Some were blank. Some had names written on them in childlike handwriting. All were recordings of girls talking, singing, crying, and humming. Among them was one, labeled C, third year. The tape was analyzed, digitized, and confirmed. The voice belonged to Claire Monroe. Lucas listened to the recording alone in a soundproof room at the FBI field office in Little Rock. The agents offered to play it for him later, when he was ready, but he refused to wait. He needed to hear it now, needed to know. The tape opened with static, then the mechanical click of an old recorder's button. Silence followed, thick and heavy. Then came the sound of breathing, soft, shaky, a child's breathing. And then, finally, a voice. My name is Claire Monroe. I'm 11 years old. Today is October 23rd, I think. Her voice trembled but was clear. Lucas felt his hands tighten on the arms of the chair, breath frozen in his lungs. She continued, Mr. Yates said I could use the recorder if I promised to be good, so I'm being good. I'm saying my name, like he said. There was a long pause. I don't know where my sisters are today. They were gone when I woke up. He said they were being retested. I don't know what that means. Lucas closed his eyes. Tears stung behind his lids, but he didn't let them fall. He had to hear this, had to carry it with her. The tape went on. She described the room, small, cold, with no windows. She mentioned the song again, how he hummed it while working, while cooking, while pacing outside her door. She talked about counting days, scratching marks into the wall until he made her stop. She talked about dreaming of the sky, the feeling of running barefoot through tall grass, the sound of her brother's laughter on summer nights. I still hum the song too, she said quietly. Not because I like it, but because it makes him think I'm still broken. A click followed. The tape ended. The agent stopped the playback. Lucas sat motionless. There's more, the agent said, voice careful. Lucas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The next tape was shorter and darker. Claire didn't speak much, just soft humming, the same melody over and over. And then, suddenly, another voice, low, masculine, muffled as if it were behind a door, spoke a single line. Sing louder so I know you're behaving. Lucas jerked forward in his chair, fists clenched. He recognized the cruelty in the tone, the casual power, the control. The FBI confirmed what Lucas already knew. These tapes were real. Claire had survived past 1997, possibly into her teens, maybe longer. It was unclear when the recording stopped. The final tape was marked 2003. After that, there was nothing. No more labels, no more entries, just a dead end. But something was different this time. The investigation was no longer a cold case. It was officially reopened. The media picked it up. The public responded. And then, 6 months later, another letter arrived. This time it came to the FBI office directly. No return address, just a padded envelope postmarked from Utah. Inside was a photograph of a woman sitting at a bus stop in winter. Her face was partially covered by a scarf, but the scar near her temple was visible. In her hands, she clutched a small black cassette tape. Written on the back of the photo in neat block letters, "I'm not ready yet, but I'm listening." Lucas was called in again. He stared at the image in disbelief. There was no doubt now. Claire had escaped, or been released or fled in some way too complex for anyone to guess. But she was out there, watching, deciding whether it was finally safe to come home. The authorities couldn't locate her. The bus stop was traced to a rural line in central Utah, but no one matching her description was found on camera. She had vanished again, like a shadow in the wind. The FBI assumed she had taken the cassette with her for a reason, something symbolic, something she wasn't ready to let go of. Lucas felt hope bloom again in his chest. But with it came fear. Because if Claire had been free all these years, why hadn't she come back? What had kept her silent? What memories did she carry that made her believe staying hidden was safer than being found? The question echoed louder with each passing day. Lucas returned home again. He didn't tell anyone this time. He stopped answering interview requests, turned down book offers, ignored reporters who camped outside his apartment. He had no interest in making a spectacle of his family's pain. But he did something else. He bought back the land. The old Monroe property, what was left of it, had been split up years ago, parceled out and mostly left untouched. He made calls, sent letters, paid more than it was worth, and within 4 months, it was his again. He cleared the brush and rebuilt the old barn, not as it once was, but as a memorial. 3 white chairs on the front porch facing west, each with the initials A, B, and C carved into the wood. He planted flowers beneath them, wild daisies, Claire's favorite, and then he waited. He didn't know for what exactly, just that he needed to be there, that if she ever came home, there would be a place for her, a quiet place, without questions, or cameras or news stories, just family. In the stillness of that waiting, the years that followed were both empty and full. The town eventually stopped whispering. The news cycle moved on. But every July, on the anniversary of the storm, someone left something at the gate, a blue ribbon, a child's sketch, once a locket. No one ever saw who did it, but Lucas knew. Claire was still out there. It had been nearly 3 years since the last envelope arrived, 3 years since the final photograph, 3 years of quiet, of staring down long gravel driveways, watching the horizon for movement that never came. Lucas no longer waited with desperation. That urgency had melted into something else, patience perhaps, or resignation, but not hopelessness. That part had never left him. Even after all the dead ends, the false leads, the silent seasons, he still believed. Every so often, he would return to the old journal pages Claire had once written, copies now, the originals preserved by investigators. He knew them by heart, but rereading them grounded him. It reminded him that his sisters weren't just gone. They had endured. Claire had found strength even in the darkness. She had sent out pieces of herself like breadcrumbs, like stars in a night sky. She wanted to be found, even if she wasn't ready. The wildflowers grew tall around the barn now. Lucas kept the grass low and the path clear, but he never touched the chairs. They stayed just as they were, weathered, silent, always facing west. And then, one evening in the fall of 2020, the quiet was broken. It was just past sunset when Lucas stepped out onto the porch, coffee in hand, scanning the sky the way he always did. The first thing he noticed was that the air felt strange, still but heavy. The second thing he noticed was the light, a small flickering flame down by the gate. He froze. The gate stood about 200 yards from the house, near the old gravel drive. It hadn't been used in years. He squinted through the fading light. The flame wasn't a fire, it was a candle, and next to it, a figure. Someone was standing by the gate. Lucas set the mug down slowly, heart pounding in his chest. He stepped off the porch and walked toward the figure, each step echoing through the quiet field. As he got closer, he could make out more details. A woman, thin, wrapped in a dark coat, hood up, head lowered. The candle sat on the fence post beside her. In her hand, she held something small and rectangular. She didn't move as he approached. When he reached 10 feet away, he stopped. Neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, the woman held out the item in her hand and placed it gently atop the fence. A cassette tape. She stepped back. Lucas stepped forward. He looked down at the tape. It was marked with 3 letters, A, B, C. He picked it up, hands trembling. When he looked up again, the woman was already walking away, not fast, not frantic, just leaving, disappearing into the dusk. Claire, he whispered. She didn't turn, but he heard something. As the wind picked up across the field, he heard it, faint but real. A hum, the same melody from all those years ago, the song she hated, the one she used to survive. Now it was hers. He stood there long after she vanished into the night. He didn't follow. He knew better now. Claire had done what she needed to do. She had survived something unspeakable. And now she had returned, if only briefly, to let him know, to offer a final message. When he played the tape later that night, alone in the quiet barn, it was mostly static. But after a minute, a voice broke through. Older, stronger, steady. I don't need to hide anymore. I just needed to see the house again. You kept it safe. Thank you, Lucas. Then silence, then humming. It was the last time he ever heard her voice. For weeks after the tape arrived, Lucas barely left the farmhouse. He listened to the message again and again, memorizing every inflection of Claire's voice. The steadiness, behind it, the certainty. There was no fear left in her tone, no hesitation. She hadn't come back to ask for help. She had come back to say goodbye. Still, questions gnawed at him. The tape was labeled with all 3 sisters' initials, A, B, C, but only Claire spoke. There was no mention of Abigail, no mention of Bethany. He tried to believe they had made it out together, but something in his gut told him otherwise. The FBI retrieved the tape and verified the voice again. It was Claire, and though she was older, her speech patterns matched the ones they had analyzed on the earlier tapes. But that was all they could confirm. The recording offered no clues about her location, no new details about Everett Yates, no mention of where she had been for the last 20 years. Until something changed. 2 months after the final tape, an anonymous package was delivered to the Harrows Creek Police Department. Inside was a bundle of documents, water-damaged, but mostly intact. At first glance, they appeared to be nothing more than property records. But tucked between the papers was a black-and-white photograph of a man's hand gripping a child's wrist. No faces, just the hand and the arm of a small girl. Scrawled on the back was a sentence. He kept records. The handwriting matched. Claire's federal investigators combed through the paperwork. Most of it was logistical, supply purchases, fuel receipts, handwritten directions. But then they found something chilling, a notebook. Inside were names, dates, places, descriptions. Every page was a timeline, detailed logs of movements and routines. Most of the entries seemed centered around the mid-1990s through early 2000s. It listed girls by first names only, hair color, height, personality traits. The notes read like an owner's manual. In the margins were references to corrections, reconditioning, punishment routines. And there, on one of the early pages, A, B, C, acquired, July 3rd, 1997. Lucas couldn't breathe when he saw it. Abigail, Bethany, Claire, each had a brief description next to her letter. C, submissive, quiet, requires less monitoring. B, strong-willed, needs isolation. A, compliant, fearful, emotional attachment to C. He read it over and over, hating every word. These weren't observations. They were assessments, written by someone who believed he had the right to take them. Farther into the notebook, entries became darker. Mentions of conditioning, failures, resistance, sickness, and eventually, disposal. Next to one entry, under a date from December 1998, 2 lines were circled. B, gone, buried behind cabin. A, ceased, ashes, Site 3. Lucas collapsed into a chair. The truth had finally surfaced. Bethany had died first. No explanation, no context, just gone. Abigail had died later, ceased, burned. Claire was the only one who had survived. The man who took them had documented everything, not out of guilt, but control, as if their lives were experiments, temporary projects. It was dehumanizing, cold, and devastatingly real. Authorities began excavating the area around the burned-down Montana cabin. Deep in the woods, behind what remained of the structure, they discovered bones. Small, buried carefully, some wrapped in decomposed cloth. Dental records confirmed what Lucas feared. Bethany Monroe had been found. A second site yielded ash remains, charred bone fragments, and melted plastic, likely from a bracelet. The tests took time, but ultimately confirmed what the notes had said. Abigail Monroe had died there too. Only Claire had survived, but even survival had its cost. Lucas returned to the site. He stood among the trees, staring at the place where his sisters had once been hidden from the world. He thought of all the birthdays they'd missed, all the Christmases, the laughter that had been stolen, the childhoods that had been erased. And he thought of Claire, standing alone in the storm of memory, carrying the weight of everything. He'd always wondered why she didn't come home. Now, he understood. She had buried more than just her sisters out here. She had buried herself. The funeral was held quietly under gray skies and steady rain, much like the day the sisters vanished. But this time, the town gathered not in confusion or fear, but in mourning, proper mourning. For the first time in over 2 decades, Abigail and Bethany Monroe were laid to rest with names, with dignity, with voices returned to them through the fragments of truth Claire had left behind. Lucas didn't speak during the service. He didn't need to. Everything that could be said was already known. Their story had become something larger than a mystery. It had become a wound, finally exposed to light, one the community and Lucas himself had carried silently for far too long. He watched the coffins lower into the earth, 2 small caskets side by side, white lilies resting on top. A simple plaque stood between them, bearing their full names and dates. And below those names, sisters, loved, remembered. But even as the ground closed over them, part of the story remained unfinished. Claire, the girl who disappeared, the woman who returned, the survivor who left more questions than answers. Lucas knew, deep down, that he might never see her again. Not in person, not in certainty. But that was no longer what mattered most. What mattered was that she had lived, that she had escaped, that she had found her voice and used it not just to survive, but to expose the truth. Months passed. The old house, once in ruins, began to take new shape. Lucas used the insurance money and donations from across the country, strangers moved by the story, to rebuild it, not to live in, but to preserve as a sanctuary, as a memorial, as a quiet place for anyone who had ever been lost or forgotten. In the front room, he created a small archive, Claire's writings, Bethany's drawings, Abigail's photos, copies of their belongings, the Polaroid from the box, the cassette, even the burnt edge of the journal found in the cellar years ago. It wasn't about preserving pain. It was about remembering and forgiving. One spring morning, Lucas opened the mailbox and found an envelope, no return address. Inside was a single photograph. It was the same photo Claire had left him years ago, the one of her standing outside the cabin, face partially turned, braid over her shoulder. But this version had something new. She was smiling, truly smiling. Behind her stood an open field of wildflowers, the mountains far in the distance, no shadows, no fences, no fear. Written on the back, in careful handwriting, were 6 words. I remember everything, but I'm okay. Lucas stood with the photo pressed to his chest, tears streaking down his face. Not from sadness, but from something else. Relief, closure, peace. That night, he walked to the gate and placed a candle on the fence post, just like she once had. He didn't light it. He left that to her. If she ever came back, she would know the way. Until then, her story, their story, would remain, not as a legend, not as a headline, but as a truth that no storm, no man, no silence could ever erase again. And under the watchful stars of Harrow's Creek, 3 white chairs faced west, gently creaking in the wind, waiting for the day all 3 girls might finally come home